Now, this obviously is not the first time I've talked about Sam Harris, and so I want to preface this with some of the good things I think about Sam Harris before I go into some of my criticism. I think in the years since the events of 9/11, Sam Harris has done two really good things. They're not unique, they're not groundbreaking, but the manner in which he has done them and the presentation of these ideas has been exceptional, I think. And those two ideas are that religions are different, they're not all the same, and I'll go into that in a bit, and that conventional notions of free will are just nonsensical and really have no basis whatsoever to begin with. The first idea, that religions are different, seems rather obvious if you think about it. After all, Mahayana Buddhism appears to be different from Calvinism, and Calvinism appears to be different from various forms of animism, and it's kind of obvious. However, we tend to use religion in a very umbrella sense, and we tend to think about religion in the sense of, well, religion is good or bad. But religion, as Sam Harris has pointed out, and this is one of the good things about Sam Harris and one of the good arguments he's brought to bear, religion is a bit like sport. You have Thai boxing, as he says, then you have golf or table tennis. They're vastly different, even though all of these quote-unquote sports can be subsumed under the category of sport. So too with religion. Sikhism is different from Sharia Islam, and Sharia Islam is different from Zen Buddhism, and the list goes on and on. It's obvious that religions are different, but only upon closer inspection and examination of that statement, religions are different, does one gain any clarity. And as a consequence, one can gain greater clarity about the nature of certain problematic religions as compared to others. After all, we worry less about Buddhism than we do about Islam, and this is an important point that he's driven home many times in the years subsequent to 9/11. The other point concerning free will is something that is a bit more esoteric, and I think it's not one of those obvious things. You can say religions are different, that's kind of obvious, and then you inspect more closely, and then, they truly are in their doctrinal approaches to things, and just in every respect. And the notion that free will is an illusion and a non-starter to begin with is not quite as obvious. But he has made this argument, and he does it in a very clear fashion. Now, I always suspected as much, even in my 20s, but I'd like to say that Sam Harris certainly solidified my view in this because of the evidence he presented. We're not the authors of ourselves. The self is constantly shifting. It is, as a matter of fact, an illusion. And we're not the cause of ourselves. We exist within a continuum of causal links that eventually, if you go far enough back, go back to the beginning of the universe, but the components that forge the notion of the self are not of our own manufacturing. We don't choose where we're born, who our parents are, what our genes are, etc. We can make choices, but the choices are all made in a context without our influence upon the ultimate contributing factors to those choices. And that is the essential crux of his argument. I think he makes that argument well. And I don't want to spend inordinate amounts of time on religions are different or free will is an illusion. I merely wanted to make the point that, yes, Sam Harris has made important contributions. They're not groundbreaking, but his tenacity and persistence in presenting these arguments and ideas, and the fact that he presented them in a very clear manner, has been appreciated by myself, by others. And so I don't just look at Sam Harris in a critical fashion, but I am not an acolyte of Sam Harris. His gynocentrism is fairly insufferable, and his blind spots are strange, to say the least. Enter into his latest blind spot, a conversation, well, not his latest, it's a continual blind spot, but the manifestation of one of his major blind spots in a conversation he had with Scott Adams. Scott Adams is a cartoonist, mostly famous for Dilbert. He's kind of a political nonpartisan, and he ostensibly, nominally admires Trump for his persuasive skills. Now, I'm not really a fan of Trump. I'm not a fan of Trump. I just think he's a politician, admittedly a somewhat different sort of politician, but he's just a guy. Now, in listening to this, what you're here right now, you'll see what I mean. Sam Harris clings to a very particular and very strange notion, not just of American exceptionalism, but of a world, a body politic, that is essentially divorced from the world as we understand it, the realpolitik of political engagement, of national interests, and one that is really highlighted by ethical and moral concerns. Now, one could say that's pretty admirable, but if we look at the history of recent modern politics, stretching back decades into the 20th century, it is not one that is dominated by moral or ethical concerns, but by interests, specific interests. Now, for example, we can take the instance of containment as practiced by the United States and various other Western powers during the many decades of the mid to late-ish 20th century concerning communism, and we can, I imagine, prescribe some kind of moral argument and say, well, look, this is the reason why we're doing this. I'm not going to cast judgment one way or another. Containment is a massive subject and really beyond the scope of this video, but I would argue that many of the policies we had enacted under containment ended up with disastrous consequences for some of the more than innocent populations. For example, if you look at the assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, September 11th, no pun intended, but on September 11th, I mean, sure, you could say Allende had horrendous policies and all of these things, but the consequence of having Pinochet in power, well, people were in prison, they were executed, there were concentration camps, and merely for having opinions or merely not liking him. There was no free press. You can say this is good or bad, but I would argue that if you're going to toe the ethical line, as Sam Harris tends to do, you can say, well, this probably wasn't the most ethical outcome. Sam Harris, of course, would come back and say, well, look, it's all about intentions. He's always on about intentions. Intentions matter. But I don't think the intentions were ethical intentions back then. No, by way of contrast, the United States wanted a malleable puppet who would sit in power and suppress communism, or at least openly say he didn't like it or would oppose it. With that said, I'm going to get a bit more into that, not specifically Chile, but more generally. Let's have a listen to this snippet of Sam Harris. Bear witness for yourself, as it were. Listen to it, and you'll see what I mean.
Again, I think the word treason, I'm not using the word treason in the technical sense, like I think he'll be convicted of treason, but there's a treasonous level of disregard for the interests of our country in how he has been dealing with Russia thus far, and the Russia scandal.
Or he's just being persuasive and practical. Both of those filters fit.
There's nothing persuasive about being the first president who will openly, without any caveat, just praise and align himself with a dictator of Putin's quality, who has just maliciously targeted our country in a way that is totally unambiguous.
First of all, I'm sure that we target other countries so that, the context is we're probably all doing it to everybody else.
Again, this is a move into a kind of amoral equivalence, which doesn't make any sense to me because, of course, we seek to influence other countries, but we do it because we actually have our values, right? We think our values are good. If we're trying to influence an election in Iran, say, the reason why we think that is legitimate is because we are the good guys there. Now, and I mean that in a fairly deep sense, right? We are fighting for democratic values and tolerance of minorities.
So you'll see in some sense, Sam Harris is out to la-la land. The idea that America is exceptional, that America is the good guy, is a bit strange. Now, I don't subscribe to the Noam Chomskyan school that the United States is bad and malicious and engages in terrorism. It certainly does to varying degrees, but I just see all state actors acting in specific interests that they find peculiar and particular to their own situation. And so the United States has done this historically as well. In the late 19th century, it was involved in the Philippines because it thought it was in its state interest to do so. There were some fairly disastrous consequences to that. And then in the 20th century, there were various state interests that were represented. The deposing of Mossadegh in conjunction with the corporate interests on the part of Anglo-Iranian oil. Both Eisenhower and Churchill thought it was fitting to do that. And we had the Shah, and then it later led to the Iranian Revolution. Now we have the current situation in the current year, as well as the years immediately subsequent to that. But I don't see any of this as ethical or even non-ethical. I see this merely as a case of various state interests, sometimes aligned with corporate interests, acting in what they perceive to be in their interests. I don't think ethics really comes into this. And this is a huge blind spot on the part of Sam Harris, and a blind spot in his judgment of Trump. Trump is probably a pathological liar based on observations, but I mean, most politicians are to some degree. Perhaps not as stringently the case as with Trump, but I mean, he's just a different kind of politician, and he didn't claim to be some monk of ethics or some great prophet of ethics. And no politician does. But Sam Harris's worldview is so warped by a kind of idealism that is misapplied. And it indeed misapplies to the United States. The United States has its interests. And nominally, yes, the United States will act with constraints. So he had a recent discussion on North Korea, and the reasons cited as to why the United States doesn't get involved and do certain drastic things is because, well, one of the main reasons is because of the population in South Korea and some of the consequences and the after effects that could have these disastrous results for them, and death and destruction and economic suffering and all manner of things. And so the United States kind of stays out of it for the most part. Stays out of it, but doesn't drastically get involved. Whether or not this is a kind of facade of morality or ethical concern, I mean, who cares? The point is that it's not in the United States' interest. The physiognomy of the United States is one of munificence and goodness, and whether that's actually the case, that is the projection outwards, and so it's in the United States' interest to do so. But this idea that the United States is special, I think this comes as a consequence for Sam Harris from a lifetime of living in the United States. This kind of blind spot he has. We the good guys, we Americans. And I'm not saying he's ignorant of the rest of the world, but he's not lived in the rest of the world. Every person, every country will look at national interests in a different way, and depending on the politics of the person and their level of involvement, will look at the country's interests from a perspective of national interest. So the South Korean national interest is not the same necessarily as the Japanese one or the Russian one. And that's all it really comes down to. States act selfishly in their political interests. There are limitations because every state, particularly these days, is in the business of maintaining the aura of superficial ethical conduct and morality. But, I mean, this is a constraint, but things still happen. People still get involved. They do things that are considered unruly or disreputable. But that's just the world we live in. I have no illusions that everyone is an ethical actor, let alone politicians, let alone the sum of the composition of politicians, the body politic, the state. It's a different kind of realpolitik that these days to what had previously been in place, say, a century ago. But it's still a realpolitik that has nothing to do, in largest measure, with deep ethical concerns. At best, the maintenance of some ethical pretense, and at worst, none of that whatsoever. So this is an area where Sam Harris has a particular bias, and I think it's largely, as I said, based on ignorance, but also just based on a kind of idealism about the way the world should be. I mean, who actually these days, upon examining democratic institutions, thinks that liberal democracy is some great thing? I think anyone who spent time thinking about democracy, whatever side of the issue you might be on, would have to at least arrive at the conclusion that at least certain elements of quote-unquote liberal democracy are questionable. You might not have a better solution for it, and you might not fully call it into question and say, well, we just need to get rid of democracy, or democracy is outright bad. But I think you would be inclined, if you examined it, to think, well, maybe it's not that great, looking at the various disastrous consequences, but he toes the line. And in this sense, he is very much blinded by his own ideology, an ideology of sort of a kind of moral supremacy attributed to his own behavior, but also just the world at large, that everyone is working under this umbrella of deep ethical concern. And admittedly, he's interested in ethics, but it's just not the way the world works. And I don't know anyone in his right mind that I converse with who's examined liberal democracy that thinks it's a really great system. Even people that are kind of more or less content with the system, such as Coltain, don't think it's a great system. I don't. I think it should be jettisoned completely. I think democracy, liberal or otherwise, is fucking awful. So, as do many other people I converse with. But I don't think this is a particularly brilliant insight either. It's just something you arrive at after looking at reality outside of the bubble that Sam Harris seems to have ensconced himself in. Anyway, this is another Sam Harris video, obviously. I do this, and I make these sort of criticism videos because I think he's an important guy. He's a lot of reach and influence, and somebody's got to criticize him. I'm a nobody, obviously, and he's not going to address me or my points. But he has a very strange worldview when it comes to things. And part of that, well, I've already listed it. He only lives in the United States, unfamiliar with other countries. He's blinded by a kind of American exceptionalism. He's almost overly concerned with the ethical to the point where he ignores reality itself, ignoring the realpolitik that has dominated humankind since the instantiation of human politics. And just a blind idealism for the way the world ought to be. But the world is not an ought, it is, right? The world is, it's not an ought. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. I will check you out soon. There will be more videos to come, assuming I'm alive and hale. Until then, I wish you a pleasant weekend, and may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.